All right. In this video, Grandpa Nietzsche is going to tell us how to live in a valueless universe. All right. So, just in time for the holidays, this is going to be a short infomercial for how to handle situations where you find out that your life is completely devoid of anything objectively meaningful, valuable, or purposeful. Okay. So, I have my coffee, which I like coffee, all right, and a lot of times that's good enough for me to continue on living. But we do not need to be crushed by the weight of the universe here. We don't need to allow the um, just the tragic cold reality of the fact that our lives have no value, purpose, or meaning to completely overwhelm us. So we'll see if Grandpa Nietzsche can actually provide some recommendations, not comfort. No, 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 no. I mean, the reality is daunting here. Nietzsche is not in the comfort business. He's not in the comforting business, as we'll see. But Nietzsche might be able to, nevertheless, give us some recommendations about potentially how to proceed here. Okay, so Nietzsche is tends to be one of the more popular philosophers. But to the extent that Nietzsche is a philosopher, this may not even be a appropriate characterization just based on Nietzsche's own writings. In many ways, Nietzsche is a critic of philosophy, and by philosophy he means traditional or sort of classical philosophy. But in many other ways, Nietzsche considers himself sort of the last philosopher, or at the very least, the only honest philosopher. So, and it's partially because of the way he writes. He's poetic. He is somewhat disjointed in his writings. He's sarcastic. He's sort of purposefully inflammatory. So even scholars who study Nietzsche professionally, there's not like unanimous agreement on what exactly he's doing, particularly in how he develops certain themes. Okay, and if you look at the span of Nietzsche's writings and Nietzsche's works, um, he picks up on certain themes very early, and then he'll develop those themes later. But he developed those themes in such a way that it's almost as if he's correcting himself or reevaluating things that he had said earlier. All right. Okay. Now, but to the extent that Nietzsche is kind of critic and honest, uh, what he's critical of in terms of philosophy is this. If we understand philosophy from the time of Plato and Aristotle through the medieval period and even into the modern period, as the attempt to get beyond appearances to get to reality itself. Okay, so this is primarily the case in traditional metaphysics, where we're trying to figure out what is fundamentally real. And this is where distinctions between being mind independent and being mind dependent, being primary, being secondary, being universal versus particular. The notion of what a substance is, that which endures through change, that which is, everything else is composed of this one thing, this fundamental thing, whatever it is. And then in epistemology, we're trying to figure out how we can possess knowledge. Is certainty required for knowledge, or can we have knowledge even if we're not certain? This extends into ethics, where we're trying to come up with objective and um, sort of a universal basis for moral conduct, questions about what is right and wrong in certain kinds of circumstances, questions about what is good and evil, or what is valuable for its own sake or desirable for its own sake. Um, all of these different sort of subdisciplines of philosophy, they've all been deeply rooted in this kind of project. Okay, so and what this project has largely been a search for these kinds of things. Okay, so we strive to understand that which is objective, that which is universal, that which is ordered, that which is comprehensible given our human categories of things. We want a world which is predictable. We want a world which is certain. So fundamentally, what we are after is some kind of anchor. Um, we want to understand the world because ultimately we want to understand ourselves and we want to understand our place in that world. Okay, but if you think about it, this is a peculiar feature to our species alone. So we are the only species of animals. We are the only species of animal that makes having explanations for things a condition of our life or a condition of our survival. We can't cope with the unexplained. We lose our minds completely. We get into full-blown existential crises when we do not have explanations for things. But if you look at other animals survive perfectly well without having explanations, right? We are the only species of animal that seeks explanations, and we are the only species of animal that makes having an explanation a condition for our life. Now, and for Nietzsche, that is a clue about what this entire project of classical philosophy, if you will, has been about. Nietzsche thinks that it has been nothing more than the pursuit of comfort. So we talk about truth, we talk about the real world, we talk about objectivity and universality and predictability, and we talk about having explanations for things, but we don't care about truth for its own sake. We don't care about objectivity. We don't care about even the real world for its own sake. Here's why. These very notions are used because they comfort us. We we want there to be an objective reality. We want there to be a real world. We want there to be truth. And we seek these things out because these things comfort us. So Nietzsche says, beliefs, however needed they may have been at one point in time for the preservation of the species, beliefs have nothing to do with truth. So even the notion of truth has been hijacked in such a way that you might as well replace it with comfort. Why? Because we reject that which makes us uncomfortable. When our comforting views are challenged, we react violently, we react defensively. When our warm blanket of a worldview, I hate that term worldview because ultimately I don't think there are any such things, but that's another matter. But when our conceptual frameworks are shaken by evidence to the contrary or those kinds of things, we react defensively and violently. Why? Because we no longer have an anchor. We no longer have that warm blanket that we can go back to. So I may not understand this, but at least, ooh, I've got my warm blanket here. Now, and this is the case regardless of what kind of conceptual framework you have. Okay, so and here's what's really interesting. So Nietzsche is obviously a critic of this classical project of philosophy and how it yields traditional concepts of morality and religion, Christianity in particular. But he also thinks that the modern age is sort of vaulting of reason, or vaulting of science in this regard. I mean, this is in some ways equally bad. So, I mean, if we no longer put our trust in religion, should we put our trust in science? Should we put our trust in human reason? Should we put our trust in understanding reality as it actually is, and having sort of a view of reality where our humanly constructed categories correspond exhaustively to an objective world that is there that we can figure out and make predictions about. That is just as much a pursuit of comfort as traditional religion is. So Nietzsche compares all of this to idolatry. So, idolatry is when we project value onto the value less, right? And we sort of bond ourselves to the valueless. All right, so if religion is idolatry and traditional morality is idolatry, and even this sort of like the new science, the hope of the scientific age, if you will, or the trust we have placed in human reason above all else. If this is equally idolatrous, the worst thing that we could do is tear down one idol just to put another one up in its place. So we've gotten rid of the idols of religion and traditional morality. Now we have science, we have classical liberalism, we have the hope of democracy, we have human progress. We'll put our trust in these kinds of things. And Nietzsche would say, "Well, I see what you're doing. So you tore this one down and you just replaced it with this one, right? So you're still looking for a blanket here. You're still looking for a pacifier. You're still looking for some kind of way to justify or explain or make coherent the tragedy that is life, right? So, and this is where he brings in the Apollonian perspective, thinking of reality as centered and ordered and predictable, and the Dionysian mind, chaotic and organic. They both have their place. So Nietzsche's not saying we need to completely get rid of this Apollonian way of thinking, but it needs a healthy corrective from the Dionysian perspective, because if life is tragic and life is chaotic and organic, um, having neatly defined categories and applying those neatly defined categories to chaos, I mean, this is just a hopeless venture. But we don't need to be alarmed by the fact that this is a hopeless venture. We can move on here. So, but at the end of the day, we want there to be an explanation for things. We want there to be a purpose for things. We want to discover some kind of reason for living despite the fact that we suffer. Okay. Now, and for Nietzsche, this is one of the more important lessons. Who are the strong? Well, the strong are the ones who can find the will to live while recognizing that there is no reason to. Okay, so if we think about the meaning of life as the kind of thing that is out there in the world which can objectively be discovered, well, then this is just a completely hopeless venture. Why? Because there's nothing there. There's nothing there. There are no objective facts in the world which can provide meaning or provide value or provide purpose. Okay, so value and meaning and purpose, they're not the kinds of things that are just objectively there in the world that we discover. Because again, what we take as purposeful and what we take as meaningful will be that which comforts at the end of the day. I mean, that's the position we've been in for thousands of years, and largely this is Plato's fault, but that's another matter. The weak individual is the one who needs a reason to live. The strong don't need a reason to live. The strong can find the will to live, the will to kind of silence the chaos that is life, or move on despite the chaos, or the strong individual, the individual who's a bundle of conflicting states of desire and passion and will, on a daily basis, can find the will to move on despite being filled with inner turmoil, largely based on external turmoil, those kind of things. Okay, so what's Nietzsche's recommendation here? Nietzsche's recommendation is we need to move on from all of this. Okay, I've, so I have three kids, two of which no longer use pacifiers, but with my son and my middle daughter, um, when we started taking their pacifier away, so my middle daughter in particular, we lay her down in her crib and then we pull the pacifier out of her mouth and she's going passy, passy, passy with this horrified look on her face. And we would look her in the face and say, "You don't need it. You don't need this anymore. Okay? Let's be rid of it." That is exactly what Nietzsche is saying about truth, about the real world, about having explanations, about needing an anchor, about needing objective purpose, value, and meaning, and this is what he largely means when he declares that God is dead, right? That the God is kind of the federal representative of this traditional way of doing philosophy. I mean, God is the source of all being and the source of all perfection and the source of all explanation. You know, God is the being that can justify human suffering, with the promise of some kind of afterlife or the promise of, well, everything happens for a reason, those kinds of things. Now, but if God is dead, not literally but figuratively, if God is dead, then that entire traditional way of understanding is gone. So we can sit around languishing and we can hang around the churches and keep singing. And when we sing, we're just singing God's funeral dirge, with all the cathedrals and church buildings across the world. These are just tombstones to a dead God. Okay, we can hang out around God's tombstone, God's rotting corpse, or we can move on. Let's go have lunch. I mean, isn't it odd that after every funeral, there's lunch? There, So you cry at the gravesite, and then by the time you're eating your ham and scalloped potatoes and bad church coffee and eating your apple pie, you almost forget that somebody died. Well, they're dead. Let's go eat. Right? It's kind of odd that those two things are juxtaposed here. Okay. All right. Now, and so he's critical of metaphysics. He's critical of epistemology. He has some appreciation for individuals like Socrates. He was like, well, at least Socrates didn't try to like figure out what was really there. Plato took kind of the good ideas that Socrates had, and then tried to come up with like a theory of reality based on questioning or based on recognizing how limited we are. That seems to be a mistake. Okay, now, but here I'm going to focus particularly on his criticisms of traditional morality and Christianity. Okay, so Nietzsche thinks that traditional moral systems basically they're basically just Christianity in disguise, because regardless of the traditional moral theory you're talking about, and he focuses particularly on, Kantian deontology and then classical utilitarianism. These moral theories are obviously developed in Christendom. They're obviously developed in Christianized Europe. So Nietzsche is thinking and writing in deeply Lutheran Germany at this point. So Nietzsche died in 1900, and the idea of the state church is still very much a thing in Europe, where the church not only has its foot in politics, but also just in culture and in music and in art and everything else. Okay, the very way we structure ourselves and understand ourselves socially is beholden to, in Nietzsche's case, the German Lutheran Church. Okay, now, but what is it that makes traditional approaches to morality and Christianity in particular particularly bad? It is this. Nietzsche says that traditional moral theories, and in particular Christianity being the worst example, make obligatory things that are not conditions for life, and they actually make weakness into a virtue. So traditional moral theories, through Christianity, make obligatory things that are not conditions for life, and they make weakness into a virtue. Okay. Now, but how should we understand this notion of a virtue here? Okay, so a virtue would just be an admirable character trait or disposition, in many ways that we ought to emulate. Okay, so the virtuous individual, the individual that is truly virtuous, depending on how we understand what it means to be virtuous in the first place. This is the kind of individual that has character traits that we not only that maybe we actually admire, but it's the kind of thing that is worth admiring. Okay. Now, but if a given person with certain character traits is the kind of person that is worth admiring, based on their character traits, then clearly we ought to emulate them. So the virtuous individual can serve as an actual historical model for emulation. Now, and there's an entire discipline, virtue ethics dedicated to this. But one of the biggest problems with a virtue ethic is, okay, well, if we look throughout history, find me an actual virtuous individual. So any individual that we would laud as a hero or kind of the archetype of virtue that we ought to emulate. For any individual that we would hold up as a virtuous individual, they're obviously going to be filled with vice as well, except for maybe Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers might be a counterexample to this, but any historical individual that you would hold up as an archetype of virtue, they're also going to have some seedy character traits or some character traits that are not particularly admirable. Okay, but for Nietzsche's purposes here, we're just going to understand virtue in terms of what is admirable. All right. Now, so first of all, in terms of talking about Nietzschean virtue, if you will, Nietzsche discusses the master morality. So, who are the masters? The masters are the members of the noble classes who create their own values. So the masters are not individuals who are dependent or beholden to the values of anybody else. The masters create their own values. The masters are the ones who are not subject to the whims or the wills of society. And and if we think about just how fickle society is, particularly in terms of consumerism and materialism, most people are beholden to the latest fad, the latest fashion, those kinds of things. The masters are not. The masters largely do not care about the whims or the social movements of society, or the flow of society. So, I mean, this idea that society ebbs and flows in terms of its values and what it appreciates and what it praises. Um, if all of us are just sort of like caught in the river, we're just moving with the flow of things, or we're just ebbing and flowing with the tide of things, then I mean, clearly we're not the ones that are in some sense in control of our lives here, to the extent that we are completely dependent upon society's contingent whims and those kinds of things. Okay, but so kinds of admirable character traits that are um, uh, sort of obvious in the noble classes would be these kinds of things like ambition and pride and strength of character and fortitude. Okay, now contrasted with the master morality, we have the slave morality. Now, who are the slaves? Well, um, the slave morality is entirely dependent upon the morality of the masters, and here's why. Um, Slave morality is based particularly on envy and hatred of the masters. So the slaves do not create their own values. The only things that the slaves can do is twist or corrupt the values of the masters. Okay, so whatever the master classes, the nobility, the aristocracy, whatever they value, the slaves will hate. Okay. Now, so and if you think about, here's a perfect example of this. Look in the Old Testament and look up the seven deadly sins. What's the first seven deadly sin? Pride. Okay. Well, if the masters are proud, oh well, to be proud is evil, right? So we're going to demonize being proud, right? We're going to say it's all about humility, right? So if the masters value strength of character and sort of like self-reliance and self-sufficiency, okay, well we're going to emphasize the need to be communal and emphasize the interdependence that we have upon each other. Okay, if there are hierarchies in the master classes based on things like strength and weakness, if there's inequality on the basis of power in the master classes, okay, well we're going to emphasize that we're all equal and we are all equal of respect and we all have the right to life and we all have the right to these kinds of things. Okay, so we're all equal, we are all beings of inherent moral worth. This is all a slave way of thinking, and part of it is based on the fact that the slaves are partially envious of the masters because kind of deep down they realize that they cannot be masters. Now, but another important component here is that the slave way of thinking is based on needing to be saved or liberated. Free us. We are slaves. Well, but the slaves demand to be masters, but they demand that somebody else make them masters. But Nietzsche is going to scratch his head and say, nobody can make you a master. Nobody can save you. Nobody can liberate you from your slave way of thinking. You have to liberate yourself from this. Okay. Now, so it has its roots in actual um, historical examples of masters and slaves. So, in particular, Nietzsche talks about how the Hebrew nation started in bondage, in slavery in Egypt. Now, but out of the Hebrew nation being freed from slavery in Egypt, out of that came Christianity. So the slave morality and the epitome of the slave religion, Christianity, historically have the same roots here. Okay, now from a historical perspective, this may not make much sense um, if there were no Hebrews in Egypt. I mean, so as far as we can tell, just archaeologically and historically, we don't really have any good reason to believe that the Hebrew nation actually started in Egypt, and wandered around in Sinai for 40. I mean, the archaeological data that we have doesn't bear this out. Now, but regardless of whether the exodus from slavery, um, for the Hebrew nation when they entered Palestine, when they entered what was called the Promised Land, from which Judaism sprang and everything, regardless of whether or not this was a literal historical event, this is nevertheless part of Jewish sacred history. And since it's part of Jewish sacred history, it is kind of by proxy part of Christianity's sacred history. I mean, so Christianity is developed using not only ancient Near Eastern themes, but Jewish themes and Greek themes and all those kinds of stuff. So given the fact that there's a message of salvation and liberation that we find in the Exodus story in scriptures, Christians develop that theme of liberation and salvation with respect to the gospel. So what we have in the gospel readings are just as much a theme about salvation and liberation as the Exodus is. So for Christians, the Exodus story points to a future story of God becoming man and all of that. Right now, but particularly with respect to traditional morality, deontologists like Immanuel Kant focus on accomplishing our duties for their own sake, while utilitarians focus on maximizing optimal goods. Okay, so in particular for Immanuel Kant is this idea that every rational, autonomous individual is an end in themselves, is the kind of being worthy of moral consideration and worthy of mutual respect, and it's equal respect. Okay, so for Kant, the very principle of humanity is present within each human individual, which is why for Kant, you're never permitted to use a fellow human being or even yourself as a mere means to an end. Okay, now, and for utilitarians, so utilitarians don't buy this whole like inherent moral worth talk, but they will say that our interests are worthy of equal moral consideration. Okay, so for the utilitarian, our lives are equal to the extent that our preferences or our interests are equal. But there's a theme here about equality and consideration for others, very present within deontology and utilitarianism. Okay, so we have things like principles of equality and principles of compassion, which all stem from the Christian religion, says Nietzsche. So the very notion of human equality, that is a Christian idea, or at least a Christianized idea. The emphasis on compassion, suffering with others, which is literally what compassion means, empathizing with others, putting yourself in their position. That's at the very least a Christian idea or a Christianized idea in our society. Okay. Now, and if you think about Christian virtue focuses on things like humility and lowliness of character and empathy and abstaining from worldly goods. Why? For the sake of the hereafter. So I will deny myself now so that it'll be great later, and the emphasis on self-sacrifice. So in the book of Matthew, if you read the Sermon on the Mount and you read the Christian Beatitudes, it's the meek, right? That will inherit the earth. It's the gentle. It's the mourners who are being comforted. It's the pure in heart who will see God. It is the humble and the lowly, uh, which end up winning. The first will be last, and last shall be first. It's about love of enemy. It's about praying for those who persecute you. It's having no concern for what you will eat or drink or where you will lay your head. Right? So this is all about kind of self-denial, if you will. That's the perfect way. So we deny ourselves to gain the goods that God has for us, right? That is the very message of Christianity. But to the extent that it is all about abstinence and self-sacrifice and life denial for the sake of either a present good that is going to be provided by God or a future good that is going to be provided in the afterlife. Well, for Nietzsche, that's the joke. Um, if this is the only life I have, and this is the only self I could ever possibly have, why would I deny my own life? And why would I deny myself when there is no hereafter? Like that's the joke, and the fact that we won't even have the satisfaction of understanding how wrong we were. It's not like when we die, we get like a 10-second afterlife where a divine being is sitting on a couch eating a bag of chips and just goes, "Hey, yeah, yeah, there's no afterlife. Sorry." And then we just kind of like are annihilated out of exist. We don't even have that satisfaction. So why, if this is the only life I have, why would I deny myself now? And why would I, deny my drives and my instincts now, which are perfectly natural? And one other thing that's important here is Christianity in particular makes our natural drives and desires sinful. So it's not only that we need to be liberated from the consequences of our sins, we need to be liberated and saved from our very natures. So I need to be saved from myself. And people go, I don't see how this sort of makes sense. But you get the theme here that if the very message of Christianity that human beings are in need of a savior, human beings are in need of liberation, this presupposes a rather negative view of humanity. This presupposes that we, by our very nature, are weak and lowly and have no hope of saving ourselves. So Nietzsche sees himself as a humanist. He says, no, I don't want to say no to humanity. I want to say yes to humanity. I mean, so if you operate from the presumption that you by your very nature are weak and lowly and can't do anything by your own strength or your own power, that is exactly the kind of life that you are going to live. But how long are you going to be waiting for your savior or your liberator? You're going to be waiting for the rest of your life. Why? Because nobody can save you. Only you can save you. You must save yourself. You must liberate yourself if you are going to be saved or liberated at all. There's no God here that we can pray to and that can intervene in our lives and save us from ourselves. That's the joke. God is dead, right? Okay. Now, so Nietzsche decries Christianity as a religion of pity. So Christianity is not only a religion that is based in pity; it is a religion which makes pity something that is admirable, or something that we ought to look for. Okay, so and who do we have pity for? So who do we have empathy and compassion for? We have empathy and compassion. We have pity for those that we find pitiful. We don't pity the strength or the strong. We don't pity those that have it all together. If I recognize that somebody is strong, I wouldn't say I feel so bad for you. And if I were to tell that person, oh, you're so strong, I feel so bad for you, they would just be like, save your pity, I have no need of it. Right? So we get this theme here that we don't need other people's pity. I don't need your pity if I am a strong individual. Okay. Well, the pitiful individual for Nietzsche is the one who laments their own existence. The pitiful individual is the one who says it would have been better to have never been born at all. Right. So turn on It's a Wonderful Life and you'll get George Bailey. I wish I had never been born, Mr. Potter. Sorry, that's my um, Jimmy Stewart impression. All right. So the pitiful individual is the one who says, I hate my life. Okay. But if you have pity for a pitiful individual and you have compassion for them. So what does compassion involve? Compassion involves taking on the suffering of another. So if you have compassion for a pitiful individual, you yourself become pitiful. So when you recognize another person's condition and they say, I wish I had never been born, and you go, yeah, that sucks. Oh, what a horrible situation. Oh, I pity you. Ugh, you know what? I hate your life and I hate my life. Ugh. All this does is it perpetuates weakness when we have pity and compassion and empathy for pitiful individuals. So if I pity the pitiful, I myself become pitiful. If I have compassion for the weak, I myself become weak. So we think that by being compassionate, what we are doing is raising up the weak to be strong. Now, but Nietzsche thinks that all we're doing by exercising compassion and by exercising empathy and pity is we're just bringing ourselves down. We're allowing the weak to drag us down, and it's all done, well, we need to make things equal. Okay, but making everyone equal is to make everyone equally weak, says Nietzsche. To make everyone equal is to make everyone weak. And Nietzsche says, well, if there are two things that are true about our humanity, it's one, we are not equal. We're divided between the strong and the weak. And two, we should not be made to be equal. So one, we're not equal. I mean, that's just a descriptive historical biological fact. We are not equal. And two, we should not be made to be equal either. All right. Now, but even if we look at the inherent message of Christianity, God becoming human is an exercise of pity. Why? Because humanity is pitiful. Why does God become a man in Christianity? Why does God become human in Christianity? Because God has pity on us. But by God having pity on us, God himself becomes pitiful. By God recognizing that we rightfully lament our own existence, God laments God's own existence by becoming one of us. God's self becomes pitiful. I mean, and for Nietzsche, that's one way that God dies. Okay, so Nietzsche says that this is a God, what he calls life denial, because life itself is what he says is will to power. Okay, so if the sort of traditional morality, which is basically Christianity in disguise, is based on things like humility and lowliness of character and compassion and pity for the pitiful. Um, this is life denying. Why? Because when you deny yourself, you deny your own power because life is power. So traditional morality makes power villainous. It makes power a vice. It makes self-powerment a vice. And humility and kindness and compassion are virtues. These are what are admirable character traits. And any character traits that stem from strength and power of will, these are seen as vice in the traditional model of things. So that's why traditional morality is just corrupting. Uh, the traditional morality, despite the fact that it presents itself as if it's saying yes to life, it's actually saying no to life. It's a denial of life. And Nietzsche says, I want to affirm my life. That's what he recommends, a life affirming philosophy. So if life itself is will to power, and will to power is this kind of basic, chaotic, causal, organic principle by which all things operate. And here's what's interesting: Nietzsche doesn't give a definition of, so he uses will to power as a universal concept and then never gives a definition of what it is. But so far as we can tell, will to power is at its very nature warfare and competition, and all life is struggle. Thanks, Nietzsche. From human struggle even to like at the cellular level. I mean, you think about your immune system attacking germs and things like that. It's warfare. It's chemical warfare, basically. you watch some nature programs, even about like insects hunting for food and things like that. It's struggle. It's offense and defense. It's poison. It's venom. It's fangs. It's crushing and bruising. Okay, that is life. Both externally, we not only live in this sort of like adversarial competition with others, we have this kind of internal struggle. Okay, so if life itself is that kind of struggle and warfare, and it's never ending, will to power involves exerting oneself in the world and affirming oneself in the world despite that struggle. So despite the so the strong individual is able to overcome that internal warfare, that internal state of conflict, but also the powerful individual is the one that is able to overcome external conflict with other individuals. Now, and Nietzsche thinks that the progression of history is just the transfer of one, what he calls a center of power, to another center of power. So, and if you think about history, isn't it true that whoever wins the war gets to write the history books? Yeah. So history itself is not kind of a purely objective kind of study, because the way we tell stories about what has happened, the way we characterize who is the hero of the story and who is the villain of the story, depends entirely on who has the power to write the story and to tell the story. So in the United States, it's the War of Independence. That's not what in England, that's not what the American Revolution is called. It's not called the War of Independence. It's not, so the English have the Glorious Revolution, right? The bloodless revolution. All these, so the same sort of, objectively speaking, if you want to say, put it that way, it's the same states of affairs, but two completely different interpretations of those states of affairs. Okay. Now, and if the kind of the archetype of traditional morality is Christian virtue, so the Christian saint, the self-sacrificing, lowly, humble, meek, gentle, compassionate saint is the archetype of virtue under traditional morality in Christianity. Well, Nietzsche has his own hero, and that is der Übermensch, the overman, but it's often translated as the superman. It's literally translated as the beyond man. All right. Now, der Übermensch, in one sense, is the individual that has the self-awareness to recognize that the boundaries of good and evil and the objective and the subjective and the real world and the world of it, these are kind of artificial constructs. And to the extent that these are artificial, we have the inherent power to move beyond them. So der Übermensch is the individual who is recommending a transvaluation of values. But we have the power to move beyond the set values. Okay. And as such, der Übermensch, again, is not subject to the whims of society at large. But to individuals that are still very deeply ingrained with the whims of society and traditional ways of thinking and traditional morals and traditional norms, der Übermensch is just going to look as a very strange kind of character. They're right. They're going to be characterized as the enemy. Okay, now, but kinds of admirable characteristics that der Übermensch would have as an individual who is aware, is both self-aware and externally aware. First of all, aware of their own power and aware that this is all artificial, and aware of the fact that they are finding the strength to live and will to live despite recognizing that there's no reason or purpose or value to any of it. Um, First of all, der Übermensch, Nietzsche says, is going to be a man of the earth and a man for the earth. So to say that der Übermensch is a man of the earth means that der Übermensch is basically inherently a naturalist. All right, not a supernaturalist. So if part of Christianity is looking to define human existence in terms of that which is not human. So we define what goes on in the human realm by looking outside of it, looking to the supernatural realm or the spiritual realm. So God's self transcends the natural boundaries of things. So God is outside of nature and yet explains everything that goes on within nature. Der Übermensch, as a man firmly grounded in earthly things, is a naturalist. Now, and to say that Übermensch is a man for the earth, affirms humanity and affirms life, Übermensch is a humanist as well. So if life is power and human power in particular is what's of concern for the overman, then yeah, no, I'm going to affirm my own life. I'm going to affirm my own power. Okay. Now, and as such, since De Übermensch is a man of the earth, De Übermensch is going to be honest, both in terms of their own conduct and character, but also in terms of just yeah, this is a tragedy. I'm not interested in fooling myself into thinking that this is a comedy. That this is a tragedy. This story does not have a happy ending. Why? We're all going to die. That's it. You know, the, oh, everything will be okay. No, it won't. Everything happens for a reason. No, it doesn't. I have no need for those kinds of cliches or platitudes, basically. Okay. Der Übermensch will be courageous, right? Dobermensch will be free, but Nietzschean freedom is kind of an ironic kind of freedom because it's to be truly free is to be completely unconstrained and unanchored. So with the death of God in particular, so with the death of God, we find ourselves without an anchor. We find ourselves without anything to explain or ground our existence on. But there's a tremendous amount of freedom that comes with the death of God. So if God is dead, sure, we're hopelessly alone in the universe, but at the same time, we are free to make ourselves into something. So later atheistic existentialism is going to pick up, like it starts with the death of God. Okay, so if God is dead, we're burdened to be free. We have no choice in the matter that we are just kind of free floating entities without an objective, certain, or universal or enduring anchor. But at the same time, it is because we have no objective anchor that kind of subjectively we can make our lives into something, whatever we see fit. So it's ironic, it's bittersweet in that we're kind of hopelessly alone in the universe, but at the same time, since we are hopelessly alone in the universe, we can will our lives to be whatever we want. Okay. Now, and another interesting thing is, and this is kind of an overlooked aspect of this, we might also expect Der Übermensch to be charitable. Now, and here's why. A true act of charity is an act of power. It's an act of strength. Now, and if you think about Christian charity, Nietzsche would say, is not real charity. Why? Because Christians give because they're obligated to give. Christians give to fulfill a requirement or to fulfill an obligation. So they're not charitable just out of their own strength or out of their own power. They're charitable because they're commanded to be charitable. And that's really interesting. So a true act of charity would be an act of, I don't need this. You take it. I'm not beholden to this. So a true act of charity needs to be completely uncoerced. I mean, if it's coerced, you're not the one in control of the situation. Somebody else is in control of the situation. And it has to be non-obligatory. Why? Because obligation is a form of coercion. Telling you that you are obligated to do this or you're required to do this, that is a way of coercively getting you to do it. But if I give just out of a sense of I don't need this, that comes from a position of strength. That comes from a position of power. That does not come from a position of weakness. So if I am not beholden to my possessions, if I am not beholden to my holdings, my money, whatever, I can freely give it. Why? Because I recognize that I don't need it. This means nothing to me. Whether I have it or I don't have it, that is not going to condition how I live my life or how I choose to see my own life. So I don't need this. You take it. I'm I want you to have it. I'm glad in you having it because in your having it, I recognize that I am not beholden to it. I am free from it. That is a true activity, right? Okay, so that will suffice for whoops. That will suffice for now. This is getting a little long, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope you found this presentation on how to live a valueless life meaningful. And I hope whether you agree with Nietzsche or not, I think we can learn a lot from Nietzsche, regardless of whether or not he was actually correct about everything. Right? Okay, I will see you all later.